How's it going, everyone? I'm Landan with LMR.com. In today's video, I'm going to be explaining the steps on how to replace the rag joint in a Fox Body Mustang. The rag joint in a Fox Body Mustang is located at the end of the intermediate steering shaft and just above the steering rack. Its job is pretty simple, and that is to provide a small amount of flex for the intermediate shaft within a few degrees of the same plane as the steering gear input shaft. It also dampens vibrations coming from the steering system. Over time, even though the rubber is reinforced with fiber, the material begins to deteriorate, which causes excess play or slop in the steering wheel. To fix this, you obviously need a replacement rag joint, which at the time of this video, we currently offer a universal option. This option is inexpensive, simple, and it works pretty darn well. Now, the other alternative is to upgrade to an aftermarket intermediate shaft, which is great, but it is costly. Since we'll be working with a universal kit, there will be some hardware that won't be needed for a Fox Mustang application. The only hardware that you do need out of this kit is obviously the coupling disc, 2 nylock locking nuts, and the 2 studs that look the exact same with the exception of the diameter of the shoulders. The car we are going to be working on in this video is our 1986 T-Top Capri. This car recently received a new power steering pump, new power steering rack, and the associated components. So while we were replacing all that cool stuff, we took the time to install a new rag joint since there was a little bit of play in the steering wheel. Now, you will need a good selection of tools, which you'll see me use in the video, and some decent mechanical knowledge to perform this job. Before we get rolling, please go ahead and like the video if you find value in our how-to videos. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and turn on notifications. That way you're notified every time we release something new. Start by safely supporting the front of the vehicle with jack stands or the entire thing with a lift. I find it easiest to pull the steering rack forward and remove the entire intermediate steering shaft rather than fumbling with the 2 bolts and nuts on the assembly. If you do this, it's important to make note of the orientation, so place a reference mark on the steering shaft before disassembling. For airbag-equipped 1990 to 1993 Fox Mustangs, have a friend hold the steering wheel while you loosen the pinch bolt to prevent the wheel from rotating. If the wheel rotates uncontrollably, it could damage the clock spring. Loosen and remove the pinch bolt with a 12-point 7/16 socket. To bring the rack forward, the steering rack hardware needs to be removed. This is done by using a 15mm on the bolt head and an 18mm box end wrench on the nut. Whenever the nuts have been removed, carefully bring the rack forward. A pry bar will be helpful when doing this. The rack needs to come forward just enough so that the spline coupling joint can be removed from the steering gear input shaft. Now we can remove the retaining hardware securing the intermediate shaft to the steering shaft tube. You may have to rotate this to gain access to the hardware. If this has to be rotated, make sure you remember the previous orientation. Multiple extensions will come in handy when doing this, as would an impact gun. This is accomplished using a 9/16 open-end wrench on the bolt head and an 11/16 inch socket on the nut. Since this is difficult to see, here's the tool selection with the rag joint removed from the car for demonstration purposes. Now you can remove the steering shaft from the car. Before you disassemble the rag joint, take a few pictures so you have something to reference whenever you put it back together. With the steering shaft on a workbench, loosen and remove the retaining nuts and bolts securing the spline coupling joint to the assembly. Use a 9/16 deep socket on the nut and a 9/16 box end wrench on the bolt head. Go ahead and drill out the 2 rivets with a 3/8 drill bit. Position the steering shaft in a vise and grind down the rest of the rivet with a grinder. Drive out both studs with a drift and hammer. If there are marks from the grinder, wipe the area clean and then paint over the raw metal with a rust-prohibitive paint. Set the steering shaft on a workbench and locate the correct hardware from the rag joint kit. You'll need the 2 shouldered studs and 2 nylock locking nuts. First, reinstall the spline coupling joint in the same orientation. Reference the pictures that you took. Reinstall the bolts, followed by the coupling joint, then the nuts. Go ahead and fully tighten the nuts. Reposition one of the small metal brackets in the correct orientation, and then install one of the shouldered studs into place. The orientation of this stud will be that the threaded portion is facing towards the steering shaft. Pass the threaded portion through the steering shaft assembly and install one of the nuts. Hold the shoulder with a pair of vice grips while you tighten the locking nut with an open-end wrench. Reposition the other small metal bracket and repeat the same steps for the other stud and locking nut. Go ahead and apply some anti-seize to the column insert. Reinstall the intermediate shaft into the car and then slide the insert into the column. Reinstall the retaining hardware and fully tighten the nut. It is difficult to get a torque wrench into this spot, so just make sure the hardware is tight. Apply some anti-seize to the splines on the steering rack input shaft. Position the coupling joint over the steering rack input shaft in the same orientation and then tap the rack with a dead blow to fully install it. Clean the pinch bolt and apply some blue thread locking compound. Reinstall the bolt and torque it to 25 pound-feet. Reinstall the steering rack retaining nuts and torque these to 35 pound-feet. Check to make sure the steering wheel is straight and then reinstall the wheels. Get the car on the ground and torque the lug nuts to factory spec. After that, you're good to go. All right, folks, wrapping things up here. Replacing the rag joint in a Fox Body Mustang or a Capri is pretty straightforward. This video should help eliminate any of the guesswork when installing the new rag joint, so if it did, please give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and turn on those notifications. As always, for the most up-to-date information, pricing, and availability on anything you may have seen in the video, please reference the description or lmr.com. Until next time, y'all know what to do. For all things Fox Body Mustang, keep it right here with the real enthusiasts, lmr.com.